The DNA report fell from her trembling hands and floated to the marble floor like a leaf surrendering to the wind. Her name was Amara, and she stood in the middle of the most expensive living room she had ever cleaned, crying tears she couldn't explain, holding proof of something that made no sense at all. Across from her, a man named Richard Hargrove, billionaire, patriarch, force of nature, pressed both hands against his face and let out a sound she had never heard from a powerful man before. It was grief and shock, and something that looked impossibly like love. But how did a maid accused of theft just 72 hours earlier end up holding a DNA report that would shatter one of the wealthiest families in the country? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Amara Johnson was 26 years old and had been cleaning other people's homes since she was 19. She had grown up in a small apartment on the east side of Chicago with her grandmother, a woman named May who smelled like lavender and never once complained about anything. May had taken Amara in after her mother disappeared. Not ran away, not died, simply disappeared, the way some people do when the weight of the world becomes too much. There were no photographs, no forwarding address, just a little girl left behind with a suitcase of small clothes and a stuffed rabbit named Button. Amara had built her life on the foundation of that silence. She worked hard because she had no choice. She kept her head down because she had learned early that drawing attention to yourself sometimes costs more than it's worth. She smiled at the families whose floors she swept and whose countertops she polished, and she never asked for more than what she was given. By the time she was hired by the Hargrove estate, a sprawling manor on the northern edge of the city, all glass and stone and cold, deliberate elegance, she had 7 years of spotless references and 0 complaints. She was punctual. She was careful. She was, by every measurable standard, the kind of employee you'd be lucky to have. Richard Hargrove, however, was not in the habit of considering himself lucky. At 63, Richard had built his empire the way men like him always do, through will, through calculation, and through a deep-seated belief that the world owed him precision. He ran his household the same way he ran his companies. Staff were background noise. Efficiency was love. And trust, real trust, was a resource he had long since stopped extending to strangers. He had a son, Carter, from his second marriage who spent most of his time in Monaco. He had a board of directors who feared him. He had 8 homes, a private jet, and a loneliness so thoroughly buried beneath routine that he had forgotten it was there. What Richard Hargrove did not have, what he had not had in 27 years, was a daughter, but we'll get to that. Amara had been working at the estate for 4 months when everything began to unravel. It started with a watch. Not just any watch, a 1962 Patek Philippe platinum case passed down from Richard's father, worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000. It sat, as it always did, on the glass tray on his bedroom dresser, a monument to legacy, a reminder of where he came from and how far he'd climbed. One Tuesday morning it was gone. Richard didn't panic. Men like Richard don't panic. They mobilize. Within the hour, he had reviewed the security footage, cataloged the staff schedules, and called his head of household, a stern man named Gerald, into his study. By noon, the conclusion had been drawn, not by evidence, but by proximity. Amara had been the only staff member in his bedroom wing that morning. She had cleaned his room between 8 and 8:45, and the watch, last seen the night before, had vanished in that window. To Richard Hargrove, that was enough. Amara was called into the drawing room that afternoon. She walked in expecting a routine check-in, smoothing her apron, rehearsing nothing because she had nothing to rehearse. What she found instead was a room that had rearranged itself into a courtroom. Richard sat in his high-backed chair by the fireplace. Gerald stood to the side. A security guard she'd never seen before stood near the door. "Do you know why you're here?" Richard asked. His voice was level, almost pleasant. "No, sir," Amara said. "A watch is missing, a very valuable watch. You were in my room this morning." He let the silence do the rest. Amara felt the floor shift beneath her, not because she was guilty, but because she had been here before, in different rooms, in different forms. That specific feeling of being looked at like you are already the answer to a question no one asked you. She had felt it in school, She had felt it in stores. She felt it now in this room full of expensive furniture and cold certainty. I didn't take anything, she said quietly but without flinching. We'll need to search your bag, Gerald said. She let them. Of course she let them. Because she had nothing to hide and because refusing would have been taken as confession. They went through her tote bag, her jacket pockets, her car. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. But Richard's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. You're suspended, effective immediately, he said, pending a full investigation. Amara walked out of that estate with her head high and her hands shaking, and she sat in her car for 11 minutes before she allowed herself to cry. Now here's what you need to know, and what changes everything. 3 days later, the watch was found. Not hidden, not stolen. Sitting in the breast pocket of a blazer Richard had worn to a gala 2 weeks earlier. A blazer that had gone unchecked to the dry cleaner and come back, watch intact, that very morning. Gerald called Amara to inform her. He was professional about it, clinical. He told her the suspension was lifted and she was welcome to return to her duties the following Monday. There was no apology, and that silence where an apology should have been, was the thing that broke something loose inside Amara Johnson that had been stuck for a very long time. She didn't go home that afternoon. Instead, she went to her grandmother's apartment, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender, even though May had been gone for 2 years now. She sat at the kitchen table and she opened the small tin box that May had left her. Inside was a collection of things May had saved without ever explaining. A folded letter, a hospital bracelet, a name on a piece of paper. The letter was from a woman named Diane. It was dated 27 years ago, and it said, in handwriting Amar didn't recognize, I can't keep her. I'm not well. Please take her. Her father doesn't know she exists. His name is Richard Hargrove. Amara read it 3 times. Then she sat very, very still. The woman named Diane, she would later learn, was her mother. The woman who had disappeared when Amara was 6 months old, not because she didn't love her daughter, but because she was sick and frightened and had made a choice she spent the rest of her short life regretting. Diane had died 11 years ago, and she had never told Richard Hargrove anything. But May had kept the letter. May had always kept the letter. Amara didn't call a lawyer. She didn't call the press. She ordered a private DNA ancestry test, sent it off with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, and waited. 12 days. 12 days of going back to that estate and cleaning those floors and polishing those countertops and looking at Richard Hargrove across rooms he'd never invited her into, wondering if she was imagining something in the line of his jaw that looked like the face she saw in mirrors. She wasn't imagining it. The results arrived on a Thursday morning. Amara was in the hallway outside Richard's study, replacing a floral arrangement, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She slipped into the service corridor, opened the email, and read the summary line twice. Probability of first-degree biological relationship, 99.998%. She didn't make a sound. She stood in that narrow corridor between the life she had always known and the one she had never been allowed to imagine. And she breathed. Just breathed. She could have left. She could have taken that result and hired an attorney and fought for whatever the courts decided a daughter was owed. She could have gone to the press. She could have done 100 things that would have made the people who wronged her very small and very sorry. Instead, she walked into Richard Hargrove's study and she set the paper on his desk. He looked up, irritated at first. Staff didn't walk into his study uninvited. That was a rule everyone knew. But something about the way Amara stood stopped him before he could speak. She wasn't apologizing with her posture. She wasn't asking for anything. She was simply standing there, present and still, in the way of someone who has finally arrived somewhere after a very long journey. Read it, she said, please. He read it. The color left his face in stages, the way light leaves a room at the end of the day. He read it again. He looked up at Amara, at her eyes, her jaw, the particular way her brow furrowed, and then something inside him, something that had been sealed off for 27 years, came open all at once. Diane, he whispered. Just a name. Like an exhale. You knew her, Amara said. It wasn't a question. We were together for a year. She left. I never knew why. His voice had lost all of its authority. He sounded for the first time like someone's father. I looked for her. I hired people to find her. I thought she just, I thought she didn't want. He stopped. He pressed his hand over his mouth. The DNA report lay between them on the desk like a bridge across a canyon neither of them had known existed. Richard Hargrove, a man who had accused his own daughter of stealing, who had suspended her without evidence, who had let her walk out of his home without an apology, sat in his leather chair and wept. And Amara, who had every right to be furious, who had been underpaid and overlooked and wrongly accused and never once given the recognition she deserved, did something extraordinary. She stayed. Not because she forgave everything in that moment. Forgiveness is not a switch, and she knew that. But because she understood, standing in that room, that the story wasn't finished. It was only finally beginning. In the weeks that followed, the truth made its way through the Hargrove household like morning light through old curtains, slow and a little disorienting, and ultimately impossible to stop. There were lawyers and conversations, and long silences over meals where neither Amara nor Richard quite knew how to hold all that had been lost between them. Carter flew back from Monaco and spent 3 days not knowing how to be in the same room as a sister he'd never known he had. But there were other moments too, small ones, the kind that don't make it into the headlines. Richard learning that his daughter took her coffee with oat milk and no sugar, and making sure it was always there when she arrived. Amara teaching him the name of her stuffed rabbit, Button, and watching something flicker across his face that she could only describe as tender. Two people, imperfect and uncertain, choosing up my name, slowly, stubbornly, to try. The world has a way of arranging people into categories. The powerful and the powerless, the seen and the unseen, the ones whose names are remembered, and the ones whose labor quietly makes everything possible. But sometimes, beneath the categories, beneath the assumption and the arrogance in the cold marble floors, there is a thread connecting two people who were always meant to find each other. Amara Johnson had spent her whole life being invisible to the people who needed her most. It turned out the one who needed her most had been signing her paychecks all along.